First of all, I'd like to send my greetings, and I'm very happy that you found time to discuss issues related to Mamluk rule of southern Levant. And I'd like to start with the agricultural policy of Mamluk state in what's now northern Jordan, and how important the agriculture was for Mamluk economy.
The Mamluk economy was based on essentially on agriculture, and it was the taxes that were collected off of primarily cereal fields, but other kinds of agricultural land as well, that went into the coffers of the state and helped pay for the military. I mean, as simple as it is, the Mamluk economy was driven by agricultural taxes that paid for military services. Beyond that, any other kinds of public services were provided through endowments, religious endowments called al-Qaf. So income producing property was donated to a charitable cause, and any revenues from that property would go into things like soup kitchens, orphanages, definitely madrasas, public education, providing clean water for people, and so on and so forth. But agricultural land was something special, and that really was earmarked for the military and for the expenses for running the state, so for the very expanded bureaucracy that the Mamluks maintained. There was a business side to it too, but it was done in an unofficial manner. So individual members of the political elite, if they were able and were very clever to convert some of their, we would call them fiefs or iqtas, into private property, which became possible to do from the 14th century, they could build those into agro businesses. And that's essentially what happened with the sugar industry, is that members of the political elite, namely high-ranking emirs and sultans, would manage to take advantage of loopholes in the endowment system and convert state lands into private lands, and then endow those lands for various purposes, or use the private land as private property for an agro industry. So sugar fell into that category. And profitable it was. It was so profitable that with the Ottoman conquest, those kinds of lands then were maintained as agro estates in their integrity without dividing them up.
Regarding the sugar industry and sugar manufacturers in the Dead Sea, in Gorsafi in particular, what was the reason for a relative decline of that monopoly during the Ottoman time? It was booming during Mamluk period, but suddenly after 1517, the sugar monopoly and sugar production ceased to flourish in a way.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense that that should have happened, but behind every state monopoly, you've got the same issues. When the state no longer monopolizes a commodity, and when there's competition from other sugar providers, that industry could fail, or at least decline. And that's precisely what happened from the 15th century on. We see it with the sugar industry in Cyprus. Cyprus was a competitor in many ways. They had been producing sugar through the Crusader period, even before that. But they produced different types of sugar. They had 3 different qualities of sugar and sugar byproducts, and they sold to different markets, and then they improvised. And that didn't seem to happen with the Mamluk sugar industry to the same degree. There were certain technologies for sugar production that were not modernized. And as a result, sugar was produced in other parts of the Mediterranean at a cheaper price and with a wider distribution. So international competition kicks in the 15th century. The second issue is if you're going to monopolize something, you better have a strong hand. And with the decline of the Mamluk state, in so many ways, political decline, military decline, and so on and so forth, it wasn't able to invest in the way in that industry that you need to. You have to have a steady labor force. You've got to force people to do forced labor at the sugar mills. You have to have control over the water and so many of the other, the transportation system. And when that starts to break down, not only can you not produce, but you can't distribute. And so that was really it. So many of the factors that led to a weakening of the Mamluk state on so many levels led to the weakening of their monopolies. Silk was another one. So silk and sugar together went into decline for the same reasons: foreign competition and a weakened state hand.
Regarding Tel Hispan, how important was the site of Tel Hispan during Mamluk period? You've been working there for many years. You're very familiar with economic and political connotations of Tel Hispan. Can you say?
That site's been excavated, yeah.
Yeah, please go ahead.
The site's been excavated, go ahead. The site's been excavated for over 50 years, and I've been involved in it since 1998, when I got my PhD. And the priorities of research at any long-term excavation, you see that they develop and they evolve over time. And the story of the Mamluk site has taken center stage for several reasons, not the least of which is most of what you see at the site today dates to the Mamluk period. So it really reflects in many ways on a small scale what was going on in other larger places like Damascus and Jerusalem and Cairo. I like to think of Hispan as being a little Kerak, a little Damascus,
yeah.
Although that's probably very fair.
A mini Kerak. Mini
Kerak.
yeah.
With a fraction of the soldiers, we kind of estimate that the garrison held no more than a half a dozen, maybe 6 soldiers maximum, by comparing it with other places like Ajloun and Kerak and Aleppo. It was a very small citadel, but nonetheless, it was an important district capital and rural garrison. And we can thank essentially a couple of sultans, but primarily Nasser Muhammad in the middle of the 14th century, who had extremely close ties with local tribes and was able to reach out politically to the eastern frontier of the Mamluk state through tribal politics, and he was quite canny about that. Hispan was the capital of the Balkh in the 14th century, and its agricultural markets serviced at least 300 villages. We know that in that century. It had a marketplace, it had a madrasa that was built there in the Ayyubid period. We're excavating the farmhouses right now. We finished work for the time being in the citadel. And those houses, those barrel vaulted houses at the bottom of the hill, are fascinating for telling a story, not just of farmers, but it looks like some of these old farmhouses were repurposed for maybe housing for bureaucrats, for businessmen, for clerics, and as workshops. We think we have a ceramic workshop in one of the rooms of one of these restored houses. And so what happens in the 14th century is a little village doubles or triples in size, essentially overnight, because a small garrison moves in, all of these government bureaucrats move in, the marketplace is pumped up. There always was a market there, but it expands because it has to service a larger region. And it becomes, for the Balkh, the key place for at least 50 years. And then that status alternates between Salt and Amman. But an important site it was, and a fairly affluent site too. So for agriculture, for its political ties, because of its military position, you've got a really good view from the top of the hill of the Madaba Plains because of its situation on several roads. Just the right place and the right time in Mamluk history for a place like that to expand.
Once you mentioned that clergymen also populated Tel Hispan. It was some kind of, I wouldn't say religious center, but since Madaba is still some kind of a breadbasket of Jordan, there's no wonder why even other administrators, not only military officials, but clerics came to live in Tel Hispan. Can you estimate how many people lived in 14th century Hispan, and how structures for 14th and 15th centuries are preserved?
The site we have today, now Saab, you've been to the site, so you know
Yeah.
there's a fence built by the Department of Antiquities that runs around it. That was
True.
built in the 70s. That fence is the archaeological site. So it's the tell and the slopes just to the escarpment where it drops down into the wadi below. The site itself is 8 hectares. And it's not that large, but what we have is a very dense configuration of barrel vaulted houses that cover the slopes, that cover the base of the land before it drops to the wadi, and then you've got the citadel on top of the tell. We've been excavating there for years, but the fact is that we've not explored fully that full 8 hectare space. What we do plan the next season is to go in with ground penetrating radar and get a better idea of how dense those houses are. We've been focusing on 4 clusters of farmhouses. The largest one has at least 4 buildings built side by side, and we think that it likely was at one point the residence of an extended family. So if you would assume maybe that on the basis of estimates from Ottoman tax registers of the 16th century, that 5 people occupied on an average what we would call a household, then you could multiply 5 by each one of those houses we've excavated. And for as far as full houses, we've dug 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of them. And so I think that would represent at least 50 people, but that's hardly the entire village. The village itself, or a medina, a town in the 14th century, extended well beyond that Department of Antiquities fence. So it goes way, way, way beyond to the north, to the south, probably across the wadi, and then you hit the fields. So I can't estimate it. It's not fair to go by the 16th century registers because there's a distinct population decline in the early 16th century, and then it rebounds. So I can't estimate, and we don't know from written records what it is. We'd have to know how big spatially the site was in the 14th and 15th centuries, and that's very difficult to do right now.
Regarding reconstruction of Tel Hispan, did you manage to understand the agriculture of the period by analyzing soils and botanical remains and materials like objects found at the site? A few years ago, we mentioned that in our article, and did you come out with new finds, new conclusions?
Yeah, we've been working with a team of botanists and zooarchaeologists and people that do lipid residue analysis and isotope analysis in labs all over the US and Europe. And if you combine all of those analytical techniques, it's starting to tell a very interesting story of agriculture at the site. Originally, we were relying on cooking vessels, tablewares to give us some idea of what could have possibly been consumed at the site. And there always was a study of animal bones, going back to the 1970s with Sten LaBianca's work. But that picture is getting augmented right now because now we're doing laboratory analysis of the contents of the cooking vessels, plus all of the sampling of cooking areas where food was consumed, where food was thrown away, so the garbage pits, the middens. Slowly, a picture is emerging of a very complicated agriculture at the site. And for me, what I'm interested in is who decided what would be planted? Was it the farmers themselves or was it the state? And we would think that because cereal production was so important for financially supporting the military and the governmental apparatus, that the government would be actively involved in cultivation, and it wasn't. So it looks like the cultivation practice of the people at Hispan, like many other places, was a balance between what the state demanded and what was needed at home. So we have at least 5 different types of wheats and barleys, much like today. It's a multiple kind of cultivation. So it's a diversified cereal production. We've got evidence of, for short periods of time, irrigation of cereals in order to boost yield and to guarantee yield in years that you've got low rainfall. And it's a practice that's known in the region today as well. Many different kinds of vegetables. We've got nuts, and these were export commodities as well, and of course olive oil. So to give you a couple of examples of stories emerging about agriculture from pots and pans, I'll give you 2. The one is a cook pot that was excavated in 2018. 3/4 complete. The cook pot we called Betty, named after Betty Crocker. She's a make-believe pastry chef from the US in the 1950s. And we had to call the cook pot something. She looks like a Betty, she's a Betty. Betty had the remnants of the last meal that was prepared in that cook pot at the bottom. There's ashes, there's food remains, and it was wonderful for sampling. So last summer, we brought several people to Bonn to work on the sampling. Alan Farahani from the West Coast, and Sofia Laparidou, who came from Greece to do work with the phytoliths. Sylvia Pola came in, worked from Berlin on the lipid analysis. And we're doing a combined study of the starches, the seeds, the ash, the phytoliths, the isotopes, everything that's inside that pot. And there is an emerging picture of what people cooked, what they ate, how they cooked it, under what conditions, what temperature, for how long, what spices they used. So we're learning a lot about kitchen culture. And one picture that's emerging is just how diverse the cereal consumption is. And we're reading the laboratory results right now. I'm reading through 16th century cookbooks in Arabic from Damascus. And they're giving us an idea of urban cooking practices. And it looks like those urban practices are impacting how people cooked in the village of Hispan in the 14th century, which is really fascinating.
How the diet was different? Was the diet in urban centers much different from the diet in places like Hispan?
Okay, here one example would be chicken. It seems chicken, of course, chickens are raised. There's no question, but eggs. There's a question of how much of consumption there is of chicken meat, of fowl, and how much of egg. And the sale of eggs to urban markets seems to be a very important one. We have a lot of urban recipes with egg in it. We've got descriptions in the 14th and 15th century of transport of eggs to urban markets. And so that might be part of it. And with eggs comes certain kinds of pastries too. So you've got a wide-ranging culinary tradition in places like Damascus of pastries that you wouldn't have, let's say, in villages. But what we see, what I think is happening is that some of that urban cuisine is making its way into the countryside in the later part of the Mamluk period, and that's fascinating. Another thing is that we had in another house a pit that had 3 jars, and this is something that we have completed publication of. And those 3 jars were included one handmade little jar this big, probably made locally, and 2 jars that look like they were imported from Damascus. Those jars are in the Madaba Museum. They're handleless, they're underglaze painted, they're quite beautiful, but well-worn jars. So this household imported 2 large storage jars, very beautiful glazed jars, to store local olive oil, and they put it in a pantry in the house. And the small jar, again, only this big, was used for making cheese. Now we know that because when we first uncovered the jar in the pit, we pulled the jar out and you could smell the fermenting milk. And for 1 year after that, you could smell the sour milk in the bottom of the jar. And we sampled it, and we've published on it in the Journal of Islamic Archaeology. So again, it's another interesting picture on local industries and kitchen culture that we wouldn't have known about only through the written record. It supplements what we can learn from texts.
How northern Jordanian highland flourished during Mamluk period, which started in 1250 and lasted until 1517. We're talking about almost 3 centuries, and of course you have different phases. Can you elaborate that? The effect of Mamluk rule in northern highland of Jordan.
Okay, so why are there different settlement cycles in the north?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, one of it's more water. The northern hills, the picture that we get is there was enough rainfall and the springs were in healthy enough condition that even in times of drought, there was always enough water, right? The central plains in the south were more vulnerable to cycles of drought. And that's important when you're talking about cereal production. It's absolutely critical. Unless you start irrigating and where you get the water is always a question. If you're right on that line of having just enough rainfall for cereal cultivation and not 1 or 2 seasons in a row of too little rainfall is a killer. And so what we see in the late 14th century and the 15th century, we've got, this has been published in Jordanian publications, a series of inscriptions, for example, in the Badia, of people traveling through looking for wheat, looking for flour, entire communities picking up and leaving, it seems. And that may have something to do with drought and drought-like conditions and failure of crops. Now, the North didn't suffer that way, and it has, I think, much to do with just the issue of rainfall and there being enough food and the agricultural markets being strong enough. Something else happened too, is that the markets of the villages in the North seem to have diversified their cultivation to a greater degree. Now, what the catalyst was for that, I really can't explain, but there were, rather than focusing on 1 or 2 crops, they spread it out and diversified and grew many kinds of crops, particularly fruits and vegetables. And that was a good strategy in the end. It really was. It was a strategy of resilience and smart marketing.
How the Mongol invasion of early 15th century affected the agriculture of northern Jordan, because the territory became the war zone between Mamluks and Timur's troops. And how depopulated was the area during that time? Maybe that was the key for the downfall of Mamluk state when Ottomans came. Because in 15th century, according to historians of Mamluk period, is marked by a serious economic crisis.
Yeah, and I don't think it had that an impact. It was a traumatic event, particularly in northern Jordan, and crops were destroyed, people were killed, draft animals were slaughtered. We know that. We know that villages were abandoned, but they were abandoned temporarily, and people returned. And they returned and they rebuilt. And so traumatic as this event was, the invasion, the Timurid invasion of the North, it didn't have, I don't think, a long-term impact, because those very villages that were attacked rebounded. People came back home and they rebuilt, and we don't really see, in terms of texts and in the archaeological record, as limited as archaeological work has been for this period in the North. Having said that, I don't think that the picture is that it wasn't long lasting. What was the catalyst for the decline of the Mamluk state and of Jordan in the late Mamluk period has to be sought in other factors. And if anything, it was the Mamluk state itself that imploded. It always had money with problems with it was always cash strapped. There were many attempts at the end of the 14th and the early 15th centuries to do financial innovations of the sort that you would play with new taxes, you would play with endowment law in various ways to bring money back into the coffers of the state, or to put money into the Sultan's pockets so that he could pay for things as they were needed directly. This is a whole debate in Mamluk studies. But these financial innovations of the Circassian Mamluk period, that's the second Mamluk phase, had some success on the short term, but didn't solve what the problems on the long term. And it's the same reason why the sugar industry declined, the same reason why the silk industry declined in places like Alexandria. The technology just wasn't modernized, the organization of labor wasn't organized, and there was international competition. That's a large part of it. And in terms of the structure of the military, we shouldn't underestimate how important the use of guns were. The Mamluks had the opportunity to use firearms, and they didn't. They tried at the very, very end, and they only gave one unit of the Egyptian army guns. Nobody wanted to use them. Cannons were used, but as a defensive weapon. The Ottomans used them offensively. So the Mamluks were simply outgunned, if you want to put it that way, in the early 16th century. It was innovative in some ways, but quite conservative in others. And the conservatism in technology and labor organization in particular was one of the most important factors in the financial problems in the very end.
Regarding the ceramics, what kind of conclusions we can draw by analyzing Islamic era pottery from Jordan?
Okay, well, what kind of questions can we ask about the pottery? The first is, for different regions of Jordan, who were the favored trade partners? Was it Syria or was it Egypt? Because Jordan's right in between, right?
Yeah.
It's the region you travel through between Cairo and Damascus. And of course, the northern ones are tied more with Lebanon and Syria proper, Damascus in particular. Aqaba with Egypt, that's not surprising, but it's everything in between in places like Hispan that really occupy a middle zone where some of the material comes from Palestine, some of it is Syrian, some of it is Egyptian. Who do you trade with to get what sorts of commodities is interesting. What we've tried to do in our work at Hispan, a topic I'm interested in is, can we use pottery to reconstruct family ties? So maybe your favorite trade partner is simply where you've got family, markets where you've got already family connections. And there are intimate family ties between Hispan and Damascus in the 14th century that would explain why there's so much Damascene glass and pottery at a site that's essentially a rural site. So those family connections is something that you can study as well. Of course, you can use pottery to study diet, like we're doing with the cook pots and the storage jars. Yeah, and standard of living as well. If combined with the study of other things, you should never study pottery independently of metalwork and glass and other genres of small objects.
What was the correlation between nomadic population and villagers in that time? How they overlapped and what type of interaction they experienced? Because it's a debated topic on how nomadic population and sedentary population coexist. Not only in the Middle East. If we go to Europe, we have the same or very similar stories of periods of peaceful coexistence, periods of raids, periods of violence, and periods of trade. So in case of Mamluk period, how nomads and farmers cooperated, if they cooperated at all?
Maybe we should think of them as two different groups, and maybe we should think of them as just two ends of the same spectrum, just opposite ends of a spectrum. We find that, we know this on the text, mostly from texts, is that people that were predominantly pastoralists also farmed. And there's a special tax category for that type of land where it's just a plot of cultivated land without an associated settlement with it, beside it. And those types of tax categories pop up in tax registers of the early Ottoman period in the 16th century. Bedouin farmed, okay, and people living in the village herded animals. They kept flocks. And often this is within the same extended family. So you'll have family members that will live in one place, but live in seasonal settlements somewhere else, or branches of the family that are living predominantly on the edge of the Badia. And that's really a normal situation. It's this is probably the thing that ties most closely the lands of the Bedou to the urbanized areas, let's say to the west, in well-watered, more well-watered regions, is those family ties. And it's also the marketplaces. The markets bring people together to buy and sell various sorts of things. I'm teaching a webinar this semester on garbage, archaeological garbage and recycling. And we had a very interesting guest lecture recently and the guest lecture emphasized the fact that in other parts of the Islamic world, we find Bedouin encampments with the kinds of objects you'd only get from the marketplace. Wheel-made pottery, metalware, glass, and we're finding glass at pastoral sites in what we think are pastoral camps in Jordan as well. How is glass getting there? If you're on the move, why would you carry glass with you? Were you only using it for a period where you're camped at that particular place? It's the marketplace. So everybody went to the same markets, like a place like Hispan, regardless of whether in their village or the town or keeping flocks further afield. Everyone joins forces and meets with one another and trades in the same marketplace. So it's the markets that tie them together. It's the family ties. Those are the ties that bind. And the state plays a role in that too, probably not a very healthy one in the 14th century, but more playing one group off against the other. That's another story.
There's also another story about the phenomenon of so-called disappearing villages in the late medieval Jordan. What can you say a few words about that phenomenon of disappearing villages? And what were the causes of the disappearance?
You're asking hard questions. I'm still working on that.
Yeah.
Okay, so my thoughts on the matter of this are this. On the basis of archaeological surveys, we get the impression that the countryside just essentially empties out, largely empties out over the course of the 15th century. The tax registers of the 16th century give us that impression that there aren't that many taxable towns and villages left for the Ottomans to register, but there's lots and lots of flocks and pastoralists and whatnot. And that changes over the course of the 16th century. Settlements rebound and the economy rebounds as well. I think we don't recognize alternative settlement forms. For us, it's either Medina or Qarya, yeah. And there's nothing in between.
Yeah.
We know in other regions of the Levant that there are seasonal settlements. They're like villages, as big as villages, but only occupied for the harvest season. That you have something that looks like what we would call in Europe is lived in, is isolated, and maybe is only used for the exploitation of a certain part of the landscape. Let's see, for keeping flocks, for cutting wood, lumbering, or something of that sort. That's tied, a settlement that's tied towards a certain industry and making use of certain natural resources, mining, for example, too. We just don't have the vocabulary as archaeologists to describe what those different settlement forms are. So my suspicion is, from excavating at places like Hispan and doing surveys in the north, are that we're missing that and the fact that, if a place like Hispan is abandoned for a time, that doesn't mean that people don't occasionally come back and use the site. And I think that does happen. And that doesn't mean that people haven't moved and built new places that are just so small or so ephemeral that we don't recognize them. And I suspect that what happens at the end of the Mamluk period for some period of time is that some regions of Jordan, the population leaves certain villages and moves away to smaller places. So it's a dispersal population. It doesn't happen everywhere. It does not happen in northern Jordan, but it does seem to happen on the highland plateaus of central Jordan. So what's the reason for that? The raison d'etre of many of these villages is cereal cultivation. So if that industry dies or is harmed by years of drought, people will move away. We know that by those Badia inscriptions. If the state is so weak that it can't maintain the irrigation system that generates the sugar mills of the Jordan Valley, that industry is going to die and people are going to move somewhere else. And they appear to, because we do have, on the basis of surveys, some idea that there are smaller sub-village settlements in different places. We just don't know what to call them. Now, if we go to the texts, we do get a vocabulary of settlement that doesn't yet have a correlate in the archaeological record. These seasonal settlements, these tiny hamlet-like places where people live just to do a little mining or to do a little lumbering or something of that sort. So I think that there's this diversity of settlement that really characterizes this transition between the medieval and the early modern period that we just don't see yet. And occupation of caves is also one of those settlement types. So I think that there's a lot of, there's a growing interest among archaeologists today, particularly a younger generation of archaeologists coming up who are focusing on Islamic archaeology that are interested in this question of these invisible places where people live. And I'm trying to encourage that kind of work. I think that what you're going to see in the next few years, keep your eyes open, but I think you're going to see some really interesting work on that very question.
Normally, I always follow what my contacts are publishing, whether they publish a book or series of scholarly articles. So I've been following up what you published in 2019 and 2020 in order to maybe work on more texts that I can use for my columns on archaeology and history of the Middle East and Jordan in particular. And my last question is, despite all setbacks, we all know that this pandemic is not going to be over very soon. What are your plans for 2021 and for Tel Hispan in particular? I'm sure you have lots of plans.
To do what we couldn't do last year. So we do plan on returning to Hispan for 3 weeks in June. But we see what happens with the pandemic. If that's not possible, then it would have to be, it could be postponed to the fall. And I suspect a lot of foreign teams are going to be thinking in those terms too. If the spring, summer seasons don't work, perhaps in the fall. We are preparing for a lot of publications coming out of Hispan, and I'd like to do some landscape work with agricultural terraces to get some more information from fields themselves about cultivation practices. So there's much more to do on the science side off-site as well. And this season, we will be doing a ground penetrating radar in order to come up with, I'm hoping, a village plan of houses and streets and that sort of thing. But we do have both German and American teams ready to go. So Sten LaBianca is recruiting his students from Michigan, and I've got my core, a very, very large PhD program here in Bonn. We are 14 strong and we're growing. We've got 3 more students coming. It is a large doctoral program in Islamic archaeology, and almost all of them are Jordan focused. So this is the team that will hopefully see you at Hispan in June.
Of course. Hopefully we'll see each other, and hopefully, not hopefully, for sure, I'm ready to publish any updated research, not only on Tel Hispan, but about other sites that you've been working with for many, many years. I'm also interested in your team of students and experts. And it was very nice hearing from you. hopefully we'll have the opportunity to meet in person next year. And I'm really grateful that you dedicated your time for this conversation. It's not going to be the last conversation. I'll probably come with new ideas, and we can continue our discussion about Mamluk period in Jordan and southern Levant, or Levant in general, because on Zoom I don't have any kind of editorial policies that I have to think about. We can discuss these issues for 5 hours if necessary. Thank you so much. All the
It's
best.
been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.